The story of the Ridges begins in the late 19th century when the Athens Lunatic Asylum was built in 1874, designed in the Victorian Kirkbride style. This sprawling institution was originally meant to be a peaceful retreat for those suffering from mental illness, providing a sanctuary where they could heal away from the public eye. The hospital's design reflected this intention, with vast gardens, open spaces, and sunlight-filled rooms meant to promote recovery. However, as time passed, overcrowding and changes in mental health treatment turned the Ridges into something much darker than its founders intended. By the early 20th century, mental health care in the United States had deteriorated significantly. Treatments for mental illness were harsh and often inhumane, with patients subjected to electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and isolation. At the Ridges, the situation was no different. The asylum became overcrowded, with patients packed into rooms that were designed for far fewer people. The staff, overworked and often untrained, struggled to keep up with the needs of the patients, many of whom were severely mentally ill. As a result, neglect and abuse became common, turning the asylum into a place of horror for those unfortunate enough to be confined there. It was during this time that the Ridges began to earn its reputation as a haunted place. The stories of mistreatment, combined with the unexplained deaths of some patients, began to circulate among the local community. One of the most famous tales involves the ghost of a woman named Margaret Schilling, who disappeared from the asylum in 1978. After an extensive search, her body was found weeks later in an abandoned part of the hospital. Strangely, her decomposing body had left a permanent stain on the floor, which remains visible to this day. Visitors and former staff have reported seeing her ghost wandering the halls of the asylum, as well as hearing unexplained footsteps and voices. Margaret's story is just one of many that contribute to the haunted reputation of the Ridges. Numerous other ghost sightings have been reported over the years, with visitors claiming to see shadowy figures, hear disembodied voices, and feel sudden drops in temperature while exploring the grounds. Paranormal investigators have flocked to the site, drawn by its eerie history and the strange events that continue to take place there. The combination of historical tragedy and paranormal activity has made the Ridges a prime location for ghost hunters and thrill seekers alike. But while the hauntings are what draw many people to the Ridges, the true horror lies in the history of the hospital and the patients who suffered there. The treatments used at the Ridges, like many asylums of the time, were often experimental and dangerous. Electroshock therapy was a common practice, as was insulin shock therapy, which involved inducing seizures in patients to reset their brains. Lobotomies, a brutal procedure where part of the brain was cut or scraped away, were also performed regularly, leaving many patients in a permanently vegetative state. These procedures were often done without the patient's consent, and in some cases, patients were forced to undergo multiple treatments, causing further psychological trauma. Many patients at the Ridges were not even mentally ill by today's standards. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, people could be committed to asylums for reasons that seem trivial or unjust today. Women, in particular, were often institutionalized for behaviors that were considered abnormal or rebellious, such as refusing to conform to societal expectations. Other reasons for commitment included alcoholism, epilepsy, and even poverty. As a result, the asylum was filled with people who were not necessarily insane, but who were marginalized and cast out from society. As time went on, the conditions at the Ridges only worsened. Overcrowding reached its peak in the mid-20th century, with the asylum housing over 2,000 patients at its height. With so many people crammed into the facility, resources were stretched thin, and patients were often neglected. It was not uncommon for patients to die from malnutrition, disease, or suicide, their bodies buried in unmarked graves on the hospital grounds. These graves, now part of a cemetery on the property, are said to be another source of the hauntings that plagued the Ridges. Despite the dark history of the Ridges, the asylum continued to operate until 1993, when it was finally closed down. The hospital's closure marked the end of an era, but it did not put an end to the stories of hauntings and strange occurrences. Today, the site is owned by Ohio University, which has converted parts of the asylum into academic and office space. However, many buildings remain abandoned, their decaying interiors serving as a reminder of the hospital's grim past. The Ridges stands as a monument to the history of mental health treatment in the United States, a history that is as tragic as it is terrifying. The stories of the patients who suffered and died there, combined with the reports of paranormal activity, have made the Ridges a place where the line between history and the supernatural seems to blur. It is a place where the past refuses to stay buried, where the echoes of those who were forgotten continue to be heard. As we delve deeper into the history of the Ridges, the tales surrounding the asylum grow more unnerving. Beyond the paranormal phenomena, the human experiences that took place within its walls paint a picture of immense suffering and neglect. The patients, often society's outcasts, were treated with little understanding or compassion, their conditions misunderstood, and their voices silenced. One particularly harrowing aspect of life at the Ridges was the sheer disregard for individual dignity. Many patients, stripped of their autonomy, were subjected to invasive treatments that were more about control than cure. Those who exhibited violent or disruptive behaviors were often placed in isolation rooms where they would be left alone for days, sometimes even weeks. In these small, windowless cells, patients would suffer in darkness, their only company the echo of their own voices or the muffled screams of others nearby. For some, the isolation was too much to bear. Suicide rates at the asylum were disturbingly high, with many patients taking their own lives to escape the torment they faced. Those who did survive often became a shadow of their former selves, their personalities altered by the brutal treatments and the oppressive environment. The hospital's cemetery, with its hundreds of unmarked graves, serves as a stark reminder of the lives lost and the anonymity in which many of these individuals were buried. Their stories, like their graves, remain largely forgotten by history. As we continue to explore the haunted reputation of the Ridges, it becomes clear that the spirits that are said to linger here may be more than just folklore. The collective trauma experienced by the patients, the violent deaths, and the cruel treatments have all contributed to the atmosphere of unrest that permeates the site. Some paranormal experts believe that places where extreme suffering occurred tend to hold on to the energy of those who suffered, creating a space where the boundary between the living and the dead becomes thin. It is this theory that helps explain the numerous ghost sightings and strange events reported at the Ridges over the years. One of the most chilling encounters reported is that of a young girl, often seen standing near the hospital's cemetery. Visitors have described seeing her wandering among the graves, her form flickering in and out of sight, as though she is trapped between this world and the next. Some speculate that she may have been a child patient, as the asylum did occasionally house children who were deemed unfit for society. Others believe she could be the spirit of a young visitor, was perhaps the child of a staff member who met a tragic end on the hospital grounds. Then there is the case of the shadow figures, which are frequently reported by those brave enough to explore the abandoned parts of the hospital. These dark, human-like shapes are often seen lurking in the corners of rooms or at the ends of hallways, always just out of reach. Paranormal investigators have tried to capture these figures on camera, with varying degrees of success. Some claim to have photographic evidence of these shadowy beings, while others insist that the figures are a manifestation of the oppressive energy that still clings to the hospital. The haunting of the Ridges is not limited to visual apparitions. Many who have visited the site report hearing disembodied voices, often coming from empty rooms or the darkened hallways. These voices range from whispers to full conversations, with some claiming to hear the distinct sounds of patients crying or pleading for help. In one particularly eerie account, a former security guard reported hearing the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut, followed by the frantic footsteps of someone running through the corridor. When he investigated, he found the area completely deserted. While the paranormal activity at the Ridges is enough to send shivers down the spine, the true horror lies in the history that gave birth to these stories. The suffering endured by the patients at the asylum The cruel and inhumane treatments they were subjected to, and the isolation they faced in their final moments have left a lasting mark on the hospital. Even now, decades after its closure, the Ridges stands as a grim testament to the darker side of psychiatric care in America. The Athens Lunatic Asylum was a place where society's most vulnerable were cast aside, forgotten, and often abused. For many, the asylum was not a place of healing, but a prison, from which there was no escape. It is no wonder that the spirits of those who suffered here are believed to linger, their pain and anger trapped within the walls of the hospital. For those who visit the Ridges today, it is impossible to ignore the sense of unease that seems to hang in the air, a reminder of the horrors that once took place here. As the years have passed, the Ridges has become a symbol of both the mistreatment of the mentally ill and the unresolved mysteries of the supernatural. Its haunted reputation continues to attract thrill seekers, paranormal investigators, and curious tourists, all eager to experience the eerie atmosphere for themselves. But for those who know the true history of the asylum, the Ridges represents something far more profound, a cautionary tale about the dangers of dehumanizing those who are different, and a haunting reminder that the past is never truly gone. The history of the Ridges is steeped in tragedy and the unexplained. It is said that many patients who lived there experienced treatments that were as cruel as they were ineffective. Some of these included hydrotherapy, where patients were submerged in ice-cold water for extended periods, and electroshock therapy, often administered without the modern understanding of how such treatments could harm or heal. Many of the patients suffered from illnesses that today would be considered treatable or manageable. However, in the 19th century, mental illness was largely misunderstood, and the care at the Ridges often exacerbated the patient's suffering rather than alleviating it. One of the most notorious incidents tied to the Ridges is the case of a female patient who disappeared in the 1970s. Her body was found weeks later in one of the abandoned wings of the hospital, decomposed beyond recognition. To this day, her death remains a mystery, with some believing that she may have wandered off in a state of confusion, while others suspect foul play. The outline of her body, supposedly left imprinted on the floor where she lay, remains a focal point for those who believe in the paranormal. The cemetery on the grounds, known as the Forgotten Cemetery, contains over 1,900 graves, many marked only by numbers instead of names. This anonymity in death reflected the patient's treatment in life, forgotten, overlooked, and cast aside by society. The numbered graves have become a haunting symbol of how the mentally ill were treated during the asylum's operation, with many patients buried without ceremony or acknowledgement of their lives. Another chilling aspect of the Ridges' history is the accounts of unexplained phenomena related to those buried there. Visitors often report hearing soft cries or faint whispers coming from the cemetery at night, while others have seen strange lights flickering among the tombstones. Some paranormal investigators believe that the high level of emotional trauma experienced by patients during their time at the Ridges has left an imprint on the grounds, making it one of the most haunted locations in the region. One of the most significant features of the Ridges was the lobotomy procedure, which was used extensively in the early 20th century. The hospital became notorious for this procedure, especially during the tenure of Dr. Walter Freeman, a well-known proponent of the operation. Lobotomies were performed with the belief that severing certain connections in the brain would cure mental illness. However, many patients who underwent the procedure were left in a vegetative state, unable to function independently for the rest of their lives. The lobotomy wing at the Ridges remains one of the most feared and avoided parts of the hospital by those who visit it today. Another peculiar phenomenon at the Ridges is the frequent sighting of shadowy figures, often referred to as shadow people. These figures are seen moving quickly through the hallways, often disappearing around corners or into doorways just as they're noticed. Visitors report an overwhelming sense of dread when encountering these apparitions, as if the figures are watching them or even trying to communicate in some way. Paranormal experts have suggested that these shadowy forms might be the lingering spirits of former patients or even hospital staff who perished within the asylum's walls. Beyond the paranormal, the Ridges represents a critical chapter in the history of psychiatric care in America. It serves as a testament to how mental illness was once treated and how far the understanding and care of mental health have come. While the hospital closed in the 1990s, the stories of its patients and the treatment methods used there offer a sobering reminder of the harsh conditions faced by the mentally ill in the past. Yet the building remains, standing as both a historical landmark and a place of lingering mystery. The hospital's past continues to fascinate historians, paranormal enthusiasts, and former staff members. Tours are given regularly, where people can visit the grounds and explore the old buildings, now largely overgrown and dilapidated. Many leave these tours with a sense of unease, feeling as though the shadows of the past are still very much alive in the present. Some claim to hear the faint sounds of patients crying out, while others experience cold spots, disembodied voices, or the feeling of being watched. The hospital, long abandoned by the living, seems to have retained the energy of those who suffered there. The stories of the Ridges are not just about the paranormal, but about the lives of real people who were marginalized by society. One such story is that of Margaret Schilling, whose death has become one of the most well-known events associated with the hospital. Margaret was a patient who mysteriously disappeared in December 1978. After an extensive search, she was found weeks later in a rarely used wing of the hospital, locked inside a room. Tragically, by the time she was discovered, she had already died. What makes her death even more disturbing is that even after her body was removed, a stain in the shape of her body remained on the floor. Despite numerous attempts to clean the area, the stain persists to this day, fueling speculation that her spirit continues to haunt the room where she died. Visitors to the Ridges, who are familiar with Margaret's story, often claim to feel a sudden chill when entering the room where she passed away. Others report seeing her figure standing in the windows of the now abandoned hospital or hearing the faint sound of her voice calling out. This specific room has become a focal point for paranormal investigations, with many investigators reporting strange phenomena, such as sudden drops in temperature, unexplained noises, or equipment malfunctioning without reason. The stories of Margaret Schilling and other patients are a reminder of the isolation and neglect that many suffered during their time at the Ridges. Patients were often abandoned by their families, left in the asylum for the rest of their lives without contact from the outside world. Some of the most tragic cases involve patients who were not mentally ill at all, but were placed in the asylum because they were considered difficult or problematic by their families. This included women who were sent to the hospital for reasons as trivial as refusing to conform to societal expectations of the time. Once admitted, many of these patients were never heard from again. This mistreatment was compounded by the brutal therapies practiced at the Ridges. Hydrotherapy, as mentioned before, was a common treatment where patients were either placed in freezing or scalding water, depending on their condition. Electroshock therapy was also frequently used, and while it had some therapeutic benefits in certain cases, it was often administered without proper understanding of its long-term effects, leaving many patients worse off than before. For the most severe cases, lobotomies were seen as a last resort. This procedure, which involved severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex, was used as a way to calm patients, but it often resulted in irreversible brain damage. Many who underwent lobotomies were left permanently disabled, incapable of caring for themselves or communicating with others. As the years passed and public awareness of mental health issues began to grow, institutions like the Ridges fell out of favor. By the 1980s, the hospital was no longer considered a place of healing, but rather a relic of a dark time in psychiatric care. The hospital officially closed its doors in 1993, and while many of the buildings still stand, they remain abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by nature. But despite the physical decay of the hospital, its legacy endures, kept alive by the stories of those who lived and died there. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Ridges is the sense that something remains behind. Visitors often speak of a pervasive feeling of sadness or unease when walking through the grounds, as though the energy of the past lingers in the present. Paranormal investigators have long been drawn to the site, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. Some have recorded strange voices or unexplained noises, while others have witnessed apparitions or felt invisible hands touching them. The hospital's haunted reputation has only grown with time, attracting those curious about the mysteries that remain unsolved. However, beyond the ghost stories and the eerie atmosphere, the Ridges is a powerful reminder of how society once treated its most vulnerable members. The mental health treatments practiced there were rooted in misunderstanding and fear, often doing more harm than good. The patients who suffered in the asylum's care were not just nameless figures lost to history, but individuals with lives, stories, and struggles. The unmarked graves in the hospital's cemetery stand as a haunting testament to this forgotten history. The Ridges serves as both a historical monument and a warning of the dangers of dehumanizing those who are different. It stands as a symbol of a time when mental illness was stigmatized and poorly understood, leading to countless people being subjected to cruel and unnecessary treatments. While the hospital may be abandoned, its story continues to resonate, reminding us of the importance of compassion, understanding, and the need to learn from the mistakes of the past. The Ridges, over time, has evolved from a decaying historical site into a magnet for paranormal investigators, history enthusiasts, and those simply curious about the eerie tales surrounding it. Yet, at its core, the deeper stories tied to the hospital are about real people, patients whose lives were lost within its walls, their pain and suffering barely acknowledged during their time. The most haunting aspect of the Ridges isn't the ghost stories themselves, but rather the palpable sense of abandonment and loss that lingers, reminding us of the forgotten voices silenced long ago. One of the most tragic and well-known cases is that of Margaret Schilling. After being left alone in an unused section of the hospital, Margaret's body was found weeks later, her lifeless form having left a mysterious, almost permanent stain on the floor. Paranormal enthusiasts have dubbed the area around where her body was found one of the most haunted spots in the hospital. Visitors and investigators alike claim to feel an overwhelming sense of sorrow, and some even report seeing Margaret's apparition. But what makes her story so unsettling is not just the supposed haunting, but the fact that her death illustrates the severe neglect and isolation many patients faced at the Ridges. Margaret was forgotten, locked away in a wing where no one came to check on her for days, weeks, until it was too late. Beyond Margaret, there are hundreds of other patients whose stories were never told. The Ridges housed patients who were often abandoned by their families, left to spend the rest of their days in isolation, subjected to experimental treatments, and stripped of their dignity. For many patients, the Ridges wasn't a place of healing. It was a place of suffering, both physical and mental. Some of the patients were not even mentally ill by today's standards. Many were individuals who did not fit into the rigid societal norms of the time. Women suffering from postpartum depression, rebellious teenagers, and even immigrants who couldn't speak English well enough to integrate. Once admitted, many never left. Many of these individuals were subjected to therapies that were, at best, crude attempts to address their illnesses, and at worst, outright torture. Hydrotherapy, which involved submerging patients in freezing or scalding water, was a common treatment. Electroshock therapy, while sometimes effective, was often used excessively, leaving patients in a worse state than before. The most notorious treatment was the lobotomy, a procedure that left many patients permanently disabled. These treatments weren't just physical, they were emotional and psychological violations, eroding the sense of self and identity of the people subjected to them. The unmarked graves in the cemetery nearby bear silent witness to the forgotten lives. Numbered stones mark where hundreds of patients were buried, their names lost to time. It's said that some of these restless spirits remain on the grounds, not out of malice, but as a reminder of their suffering and the neglect they endured. The cemetery, much like the hospital itself, has become a focus for those investigating the paranormal. Strange mists, orbs of light, and inexplicable cold spots are often reported by visitors. But these occurrences are also a stark reminder of how many patients died anonymously, without a proper acknowledgement of their lives or their deaths. Investigators often bring advanced equipment to document these strange occurrences: audio recorders, thermal cameras, EMF detectors, all in the hopes of catching something supernatural. While some dismiss these claims as overactive imaginations or tricks of light, others swear by the experiences they've had, from hearing disembodied voices to feeling an overwhelming sense of dread or sadness in specific parts of the hospital. There's a deeper layer of tragedy within the Ridges, as it also became a focal point for the larger reform movement in mental health. By the 1960s and 1970s, public perception of psychiatric treatment was changing. Exposés on asylums like the Ridges brought attention to the inhumane conditions many patients lived in, and public outrage grew. People began to understand that mental illness was not a curse or a sign of moral failure, but a medical condition that required compassionate care. This shift in attitude led to reforms in mental health treatment, and eventually, the Ridges was no longer a viable institution. It officially closed in 1993, leaving behind a legacy of mistreatment, but also contributing to the conversation about how society could better care for its most vulnerable. The Ridges, in its abandonment, holds an important place in the history of psychiatric care. It is a stark reminder of the mistakes made in the past and serves as a cautionary tale for the future. While the grounds are now quiet and the wards empty, the weight of what happened there still lingers in the air. Visitors are not just exploring a haunted location, but walking through the remnants of lives lost to a flawed system. Those drawn to the Ridges may come for the ghost stories, but what they leave with is often a sense of profound sadness, a reminder of how easy it is for the forgotten to fade into obscurity if we are not vigilant. The stories of individual escapes from the Ridges also highlight the desperation felt by many patients. In the dead of night, some attempted to flee, seeking freedom from the institution that held them captive. One well-documented escape involved a group of patients who managed to break free from the confines of their locked ward. They navigated the sprawling grounds under the cover of darkness, hoping to make it past the heavily guarded perimeter. Despite their efforts, they were eventually captured, but their escape attempt demonstrated the intense desire to break away from the horrors they endured inside. These desperate acts of escape often ended in failure, with the recaptured patients being subjected to even harsher conditions as punishment. For those who remained within the walls of the Ridges, the sense of entrapment was both physical and psychological. Patients were stripped of their autonomy, their daily lives dictated by the strict routines of the institution. Many spent years in the asylum, with little hope of ever returning to the outside world. Even for those who were not actively trying to escape, the mental toll of life at the Ridges was immense. Patients were often subjected to isolation, where they were left alone for hours or even days, cut off from any form of human contact. The isolation rooms, stark and windowless, became a place of torment for many. In these rooms, patients would scream and cry out, but their pleas often went unanswered. The silence that followed was perhaps more terrifying than the noise, a reminder that they were truly alone. In addition to the individual stories of suffering, the institution's role in the broader context of mental health treatment serves as a powerful reminder of how far we have come and how far we still need to go. The Ridges was part of a system that viewed mental illness as something to be feared, controlled, and, in many cases, hidden away. The treatments administered were not intended to cure, but to manage, often leaving patients in worse conditions than when they arrived. The stories of those who lived and died within the Ridges paint a picture of a society that failed to understand or care for its most vulnerable. Comparing the treatment at the Ridges to modern psychiatric care reveals stark contrasts. Today, mental health treatment emphasizes patient dignity, autonomy, and individualized care plans. The use of inhumane treatments like lobotomies and electroshock therapy has been largely replaced by more compassionate and evidence-based approaches. Yet, while modern psychiatry has made significant advancements, the stigma surrounding mental illness persists. The Ridges stands as a reminder of the dangers of treating mental illness as something to be hidden or feared, rather than understood and supported. In this sense, the Ridges is more than just a haunted building. It's a symbol of a bygone era in mental health care, a period marked by misunderstanding, mistreatment, and neglect. The lingering spirits that many claim to encounter are in a way metaphors for the unresolved pain of those who lived and died within its walls. Their stories remain unfinished, just as the broader story of mental health care is still being written today. While the ghost stories and paranormal encounters make the Ridges a fascinating location for thrill seekers and paranormal enthusiasts, the true horror lies in the history that unfolded within its walls. The institution's dark legacy is a sobering reminder of the consequences of a society that fails to care for its most vulnerable members. As we continue to grapple with issues surrounding mental health, the Ridges serves as a cautionary tale of what can happen when we turn a blind eye to those in need. The tales of disembodied voices, shadowy figures, and cold spots are chilling, but they pale in comparison to the real suffering that took place at the Ridges. The institution may be empty now, its rooms and corridors silent, but the memory of what happened there will continue to haunt us. It is only through remembering the past and learning from it that we can hope to create a future where mental illness is treated with the care and respect it deserves. The Ridges, now an abandoned relic of the past, stands as a physical manifestation of a history deeply rooted in suffering and neglect. Yet, within its dilapidated walls, the past feels anything but distant. The institution's crumbling exterior and overgrown grounds do little to mask the weight of the tragedies that unfolded there. Visitors report an oppressive atmosphere, as though the pain and fear of the former patients linger, woven into the very structure of the building. For those who step foot inside, it is not merely the eerie silence that unnerves, but the sense that they are never truly alone. The shadows that seem to shift in the corners of rooms, the faint sounds of sobbing or footsteps in the empty hallways, and the sudden drop in temperature all contribute to the feeling that the past has not let go of the Ridges. Paranormal investigators often describe the building as a place where the boundary between the living and the dead is at its thinnest. Many who have ventured into the Ridges at night recount experiences that defy explanation. Electronic equipment, malfunctions, strange lights appearing out of nowhere, and even physical sensations like being touched by unseen hands. Some claim to have heard voices pleading or whispering in the dark. Whether these occurrences are the remnants of the spirits of former patients or simply the product of an overactive imagination, they serve as a chilling reminder of the suffering endured within those walls. As the years pass, interest in the Ridges has only grown. It is now a popular destination for ghost hunters and those fascinated by the paranormal, drawn to the tragic history and the promise of encountering something beyond the realm of the ordinary. But for those who study the history of the institution, the fascination lies not only in the ghost stories, but in the reflection on how far we have come in the treatment of mental illness, and how easily we could fall back into old patterns if we are not vigilant. The cemetery near the Ridges, with its numbered gravestones, is a final testament to the lives lost and forgotten. Each stone represents a person who lived, suffered, and died without the dignity of a name on their grave. For some, the belief is that these spirits remain tied to the land, not out of vengeance, but out of a longing to be remembered. Their stories are unfinished, their suffering unresolved. As the Ridges continues to stand, decaying but not forgotten, it reminds us that history never truly fades away. The lessons learned from the mistakes made there continue to resonate, urging us to examine how we treat those who cannot speak for themselves. The stories of those who perished within its walls may never be fully uncovered, but the weight of their experiences demands that we never forget them. And now, as the lights dim and the whispers of history seem to echo through the halls of the Ridges, one question remains for those brave enough to visit. Do you believe the spirits of the past are still waiting for someone to finally hear their voices?